The job posting appeared on a Tuesday night, sandwiched between ads for warehouse work and a driving gig that paid $11 an hour. Marcus Reed almost scrolled past it. He almost closed the laptop and went to bed, accepting the quiet defeat that had become his nightly ritual, the unpaid electric bill on the kitchen counter, the dental appointment reminder pinned to the fridge, the sound of his daughter Ava's breathing through the thin wall that separated their bedrooms. He almost let the moment pass. The ad was 3 lines long. No company name, no salary range, no job title. Just this: seeking one honest person, no experience required. The right candidate will have their life changed. Inquiries by email only. Marcus sat in the dark for 20 minutes before he typed anything. Then he wrote 4 sentences about himself: who he was, what he had lost, what he still had, and hit send before he could think better of it. He expected nothing. He had stopped expecting things a long time ago. The limousine arrived the following morning at 7:15. Marcus Reed was 38 years old and had been a mechanic for most of his adult life. He had the hands to prove it, knuckles that had been split and healed over so many times that the skin there was thick and pale, fingernails that never came entirely clean no matter how hard he scrubbed. He had worked at Holloway Auto and Body on the east side of the city for 11 years, until the shop closed 18 months ago, when the building was sold to a developer who turned it into a mixed-use retail space nobody could afford to shop in. Since then, he had been cycling through whatever work he could find. Tuesday and Thursday mornings, he drove a delivery route for a regional grocery distributor, loading and unloading from 4 in the morning until noon. 3 nights a week, he worked security at a parking garage downtown, standing in the cold in a reflective vest, waving SUVs toward open spaces. And on weekends, he picked up whatever cash jobs came through his phone: someone's leaking pipe, someone else's gutters, a fence repair in a neighborhood where every house had a 2-car garage, and a sprinkler system that cost more than Marcus made in a month. He did the math every Sunday night, sitting at the kitchen table with a calculator and the same stack of bills arranged in order of urgency. The math never worked out. His wife, Diane, had died of an aggressive form of cervical cancer 2 years, 4 months, and 11 days before the limousine came. She had been 35 years old. They had been together since they were both 22, when they met in the waiting room of a job placement office, and she had lent him a pen because he'd forgotten his. He still had the pen. He kept it in the drawer of his nightstand and had never used it since. Their daughter Ava was 8. She had her mother's dark eyes and her father's stubbornness and a laugh that could fill a whole room if she let it. She was careful with her laugh in public. Kids at school had started making comments about her sneakers, her backpack, the lunches Marcus packed for her sandwiches and fruit, because he couldn't afford the cafeteria hot lunch every day. Ava had stopped telling him about the comments. He knew anyway. The apartment they lived in was on the 3rd floor of a building on Decker Avenue that had been nice once, maybe 30 years ago, before the plumbing began to fail, and the landlord, a man named Gerald Fitch, stopped fixing things. The hallway smelled of mildew and cigarette smoke, and someone on the 2nd floor who cooked cabbage every evening. The window in Ava's room didn't close all the way, and in winter Marcus stuffed an old towel along the sill to keep out the draft. Fitch had been calling more frequently. The rent had gone up twice in the past year, and Marcus was 2 weeks behind on the latest increase. He had spoken to Fitch on the phone 4 days before the limousine arrived, and the conversation had gone the way those conversations always went: polite, careful, loaded with the kind of patience that is just barely restraint. Fitch had used the word "unfortunately" 4 times in 7 minutes. That night, after Ava was asleep, Marcus sat at the kitchen table and opened his laptop. He went through his usual circuit job boards, classified sites, freelance platforms where people paid other people small amounts of money to do things they didn't want to do. He was tired in a way that sleep didn't fix. He was the kind of tired that comes from trying hard for a long time without anything giving way. The posting stood out because it was strange. Not promising strange. There was no company logo, no boilerplate about benefits packages, no description of a role or a reporting structure. Just those 3 lines and an email address that was a random string of letters and numbers. Every rational instinct Marcus possessed told him it was a scam. He was an intelligent man. He understood what desperation could do to a person's judgment. He wrote the email anyway. He told the truth, because that was the only thing he knew how to do anymore. He said he was a mechanic without a shop. He said he had a daughter who needed him to figure things out. He said he didn't know what he was applying for, but that he was someone who showed up and kept his word and hadn't yet stopped believing those things mattered. He closed the laptop and went to bed and lay in the dark listening to the building settle around him, and after a while he slept. The limousine was a Mercedes-Benz S-Class, stretched, matte black, with windows so deeply tinted they absorbed the morning light rather than reflecting it. It sat at the curb in front of 440 Decker Avenue, like a foreign object, a thing that belonged in a different city, a different economic universe, and had somehow been set down in the wrong place by accident. Marcus noticed it from the kitchen window while he was making Ava's breakfast. He stood at the stove with a spatula in his hand and looked down at the street and then looked away, because he assumed it had nothing to do with him. Then he looked again. The driver was standing beside the car. He was a compact white man in his 50s, in a charcoal suit that fit him precisely, holding a small white card. He was looking up at the building's entrance with the patient, unhurried manner of someone who had been trained to wait. Neighbors were already at their windows. Mrs. Kowalski from 3B had her curtain pulled aside. The two teenage boys from the ground floor were sitting on the front steps, pretending to look at their phones. Someone had opened a window on the second floor to get a better angle. Marcus's phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "Your car is outside." He turned the burner off. He stood in the kitchen for a moment, processing what that meant, then went to Ava's room. "I need you to eat and get yourself ready," he said. "Mrs. Paulson will walk you to school." "I'll call her." Ava was already dressed and reading, sitting cross-legged on her bed with a library book about marine biology open on her lap. She looked up at him with Diane's eyes. "Okay," she said. "Is everything all right?" "Everything's fine," he said, and pressed a kiss to the top of her head. He put on the cleanest shirt he owned, a blue button-down he reserved for job interviews, and went downstairs. The driver looked at him as he came through the entrance. "Mr. Marcus Reed? That's me. I'm Raymond." The driver didn't explain anything else. He simply opened the rear door with a smooth, practiced motion, the way someone opens a door who has never once in their professional life been asked why. Marcus looked at the open door, then at Raymond, then at the tinted interior beyond. He thought about every decision in his life that had been made in a moment exactly like this, some threshold crossed before he fully understood what lay on the other side. He thought about the pen in his nightstand drawer. He got in. The interior was cool and quiet, the leather seats the color of cream. There was a partition of dark glass between the passenger compartment and the driver's section, and soft, ambient light that seemed to come from nowhere in particular. The car smelled of something expensive, cedar or vetiver, or the specific absence of every cheap thing Marcus had ever owned. Across from him, watching him with an expression that gave nothing away, sat a woman he recognized. Evelyn Sinclair was on the cover of things, finance magazines, business supplements, the occasional profile in the kind of publication that ran photographs of people's home offices and asked them about their morning routines. She was the founder and chief executive of Sinclair Capital Group, a private equity firm that Marcus knew about only in the vague, ambient way that people know about things that exist entirely outside their own lives. She was 41 years old. She was worth, according to the last piece Marcus had inadvertently read while waiting at a dentist's office 2 years ago, somewhere in the neighborhood of $6 billion. She was watching him the way she watched everything. Marcus would later come to understand, as if she were assessing load-bearing capacity. "Mr. Reed," she said, "I've been studying your file for 3 months." The word file made something in Marcus's chest tighten. "I don't have a file," he said. "Everyone has a file," Evelyn said. "Yours is more interesting than most." The car moved through the city without Marcus quite registering where they were going. Evelyn Sinclair spoke with the directness of someone who had learned early that every hedged sentence costs money. She explained the situation in 12 minutes. Marcus listened without interrupting, partly because he was raised not to interrupt, and partly because the situation was so far outside his frame of reference that he needed every word to land properly before he could respond. Sinclair Capital Group was in the process of finalizing a merger with a European infrastructure fund, a transaction valued at approximately $3 billion. It was the largest deal of Evelyn's career, and the one that would define the firm's direction for the next decade. The two lead partners on the European side had grown cautious. Their hesitation was not financial, the numbers were sound. The hesitation was, as Evelyn described it, without any particular emotion, personal. They want to know they're partnering with someone stable, she said. Someone with roots. Someone whose life has a shape they recognize. Marcus looked at her. And your life doesn't have that shape. My life is a balance sheet, she said. It always has been. That used to be sufficient. She paused. And in the pause, something moved across her face, not quite vulnerability, but the edge of it. It no longer appears to be. 3 members of her board of directors had begun to move against her. She knew their names, their motivations, their timelines. One of them, a man named Vincent Cole, who had joined the board 18 months ago and spent the subsequent period quietly building alliances, had framed her lack of personal stability as a liability. He had told the European partners, through appropriate intermediaries, that Evelyn Sinclair was the kind of executive whose single-mindedness was an asset in growth phases and a risk at scale. What Evelyn needed, for exactly 30 days, was a husband. Not legally, not permanently. A presence. Someone who could stand beside her at the due diligence dinners and the firm's annual investor reception and a charity gala the following weekend that the European partners would also attend. Someone credible. Someone whose credibility came from something other than money, because the men she could have paid to perform this service had the particular hollowness of men who perform services. I chose you, Evelyn said, because you are not hollow. Marcus sat with that for a moment. Then he said, This is a lie. It is a performance, she said. Lies are shameful. Performances serve a purpose. That's a distinction without a difference. For the first time, something that might have been respect shifted in her expression. Perhaps, she said. I'm asking you anyway. He said no. He said it clearly, and without anger. And then he asked Raymond to pull over so he could get out. Evelyn didn't argue. She told him the compensation would be $500,000, deposited in escrow on the day they signed and released to him on day 31, regardless of whether the merger succeeded. The car pulled over. Marcus sat with his hand on the door handle for a long time. He thought about Gerald Fitch and the word unfortunately. He thought about Ava's sneakers and the towel stuffed along the windowsill. He thought about Diane's pen in the nightstand drawer and the way it felt to hold it, the permanence of objects that outlast the people who gave them to you. He thought about what $500,000 would mean. Not luxury. He didn't want luxury. He wanted to stop being 2 weeks behind on everything. He wanted Ava to go to the dentist without him having to choose between the copay and the electric bill. He wanted, in the most fundamental sense, to stop drowning in the specific way he had been drowning. He asked for a day to think. Evelyn gave him the evening. Raymond drove him home. When Marcus walked into his apartment, Ava was at the kitchen table working on a worksheet. And she looked up and said, There was a fancy car out front this morning. And Marcus said, I know. And she said, Is everything all right? And he said, I think so. And sat down at the table beside her and helped her with her homework and did not think about anything else until she was asleep. Then he thought about everything else for 4 hours. In the morning, he called the number Evelyn had given him and said yes. The guest suite in Evelyn Sinclair's townhouse on the north side of the city was larger than Marcus's entire apartment. This was the first thing he noted, with the careful, methodical eye of someone who grew up measuring the value of space. The second thing he noted was that every surface in the suite was clean in the particular way that spaces are clean when someone else is responsible for their cleanliness, a kind of impersonal perfection that had nothing to do with the person living there. The arrangement was this. Ava would stay with Marcus's sister, Nora, for the duration of the 30 days. Nora lived 20 minutes away, in a small house in the Fernwood neighborhood. And she adored Ava and had been furious and worried in equal measure when Marcus explained the broad outlines of the situation. He told her the truth, the real truth, not Evelyn's version of it, and she listened, and then she said, "You've always made decisions that don't make sense until later." He thought that was probably right. The first week was an education. Evelyn had a woman named Patricia, who served as a kind of all-purpose advisor on matters of social presentation, wardrobe, etiquette, the specific choreography of moving through certain environments without attracting the wrong kind of attention. Patricia was 60, brisk, and completely unsentimental. She assessed Marcus the way a contractor assesses a structure, identifying what was load-bearing and what needed reinforcement. "Your posture is excellent," she told him on the first morning. "Your voice is good. You have the advantage of looking like someone who has done physical things in the world, which certain people find reassuring." She paused. "We will need to work on the fork situation." The fork situation, Marcus discovered, was the entire system of Western formal table service, which had rules that seemed designed specifically to make people like him feel inadequate. He sat through 2 hours of instruction with the focus he brought to anything mechanical, isolating the principles, understanding the sequence, practicing until the movements stopped feeling foreign. By the third evening, he could navigate a 6-course place setting without thinking about it, which felt simultaneously like an achievement and a minor indignity. What Patricia could not address, and did not try to, was Marcus himself. He was who he was. At the first event, a dinner for 12 at a restaurant, where the menu had no prices, he spoke to the waitstaff with the same attention and directness he gave to everyone else. He remembered the name of the sommelier after hearing it once and used it again at the end of the evening, which visibly surprised the man. He asked the executive chef, who came out briefly to receive compliments, a specific and genuine question about the preparation of a dish, and they ended up talking for 6 minutes, while the other guests at the table watched with an expression Marcus couldn't quite categorize. Later, in the car home, Evelyn said nothing for several minutes. Then she said, "You made a better impression than I did tonight." "You made a fine impression," Marcus said. "I made a professional impression," she said. "That is not the same thing." She looked out the window. "People remembered your name. They'll forget mine by Thursday." He didn't point out that her name was on the wall of the restaurant's private room in gold letters because her firm had sponsored the event. He didn't think that was what she meant. The townhouse had a full staff, a housekeeper, a driver, a personal assistant named Drew who was 26 and operated with the frenetic efficiency of someone who had 4 things due simultaneously at all times. There was also, in the kitchen, a chef named Walter, who was 63 and had spent 20 years cooking for a hotel in Lyon before Evelyn hired him away. Walter was the only person in the household who seemed entirely comfortable. Marcus found Walter in the kitchen at 6 in the morning on his 3rd day, and they talked for an hour about nothing in particular: food, the city, the way certain neighborhoods changed over decades. Walter had a granddaughter who was 9, and when Marcus mentioned Ava, the old man's whole face reorganized itself into something warm and open. After that, Marcus made a point of stopping in the kitchen each morning, and the conversations became something he looked forward to. Evelyn noticed. She noticed everything. Marcus was beginning to understand. She simply processed most of it without external reaction. On the 8th day, Marcus found a photograph. He had gone looking for extra pillows in the townhouse's 3rd-floor linen closet and had instead opened the wrong door, a small sitting room that was clearly used rarely. Dust along the edges of the window seat, the specific stillness of a space that has been preserved rather than lived in. On the side table was a silver-framed photograph of a girl, perhaps 10 years old, in a school uniform, holding a trophy for something. The girl had Evelyn's jaw and eyes, and the rigid posture of someone who has been told to stand up straight so many times it has become involuntary. The trophy, Marcus could read from where he stood, was for debate. "My mother took that," Evelyn said from the doorway. Marcus turned. She was in a robe, her hair down, holding a glass of water. Without the armor of her professional presentation, the precise tailoring, the jewelry, the way she occupied public space as if she had claimed it, she looked different. Not smaller, but less constructed. "I'm sorry," Marcus said. "Wrong door. It's all right." She came into the room and looked at the photograph with the particular expression of someone looking at something they don't let themselves look at often. I was good at arguing. Even then, my father considered it useful. My mother considered it unbecoming. A pause. My father won that disagreement, as he won most of them. Where is he now? Dead, she said, without grief but also without relief. 7 years ago, he left me the firm and a 12-point memorandum about what I was and was not allowed to do with it. She looked at Marcus. I violated approximately 9 of the 12 points. He would be furious. Marcus almost smiled. Is that satisfying? Occasionally, she said. Less than I expected. They stood in the dim room together for a moment, and then Evelyn's phone rang the specific ring she'd assigned to her assistant, and the moment ended. She left. Marcus found the linen closet, got the extra pillows, and went back to his room. But something had shifted. He couldn't have named it precisely. It was the difference between understanding something intellectually and understanding it in the bones, the recognition that Evelyn Sinclair's coldness was not innate but architectural. It had been built over decades as a response to specific pressures. He had spent enough time in garages to know the difference between a machine that had been designed to run cold and one that had been modified to suppress its natural temperature. 3 days later, Ava came for a Saturday visit. Marcus had negotiated this as a condition of the arrangement. Evelyn had agreed with the detached reasonableness she brought to all logistical questions. She had not, Marcus suspected, thought very carefully about what it would mean to have an 8-year-old in the house. Ava arrived at 11 and proceeded to examine the townhouse with the systematic thoroughness of a building inspector. She asked Walter about the equipment in the kitchen, and Walter, delighted, spent 45 minutes teaching her to make pasta from scratch. She asked Drew about the 12 screens on his desk and whether he was a spy. She asked Evelyn, whom she encountered in the living room and introduced herself to with a handshake. Do you live here by yourself? Yes, Evelyn said. Ava considered this. Do you have any pets? No. Do you want any? Evelyn looked at the girl with an expression Marcus had not seen before. Something had been caught off guard. I haven't thought about it, she said. You should get a dog, Ava said. They help. Later, after Marcus had taken Ava back to Nora's and returned to the townhouse, he found Evelyn in the kitchen with a cup of coffee, which she almost never used, standing at the window looking at the garden. Your daughter, Evelyn said, not turning around, is quite something. I know, Marcus said. She asked me if I was lonely. Evelyn said it without particular emotion, the way she said most things. I didn't answer her. What would the answer have been? A long pause. I would have said no, Evelyn said. But that would have been the kind of answer I give automatically. Because it's the answer that requires the least from me. She turned her coffee cup in her hands. I'm not sure I know the real answer. Marcus said nothing. He made himself a glass of water and leaned against the counter, and they stood in the kitchen together in the quiet. And it was the most honest either of them had been in a long time. Vincent Cole was the kind of man who seemed warm until you paid close attention. He was 60, silver-haired, with a laugh that arrived a beat too late and eyes that were doing something different from his smile at all times. He had been introduced to Marcus at the investor reception on day 14 as an old friend of Evelyn's, which was the kind of introduction that contains more information in what it omits than what it includes. Marcus, Vincent had said, gripping his hand with the practiced pressure of someone who has read about handshakes. Evelyn's told me so much about you. Evelyn had told Vincent nothing. Marcus understood this intuitively and confirmed it later. What Vincent meant was that he had researched Marcus himself and was letting him know it. The story broke on a Thursday morning in a financial blog that specialized in the kind of coverage that was technically sourced and structured specifically to avoid liability. The headline was careful, the content less so. It described, with details that could only have come from someone with access to certain documents, the existence of a contractual arrangement between Evelyn Sinclair and an unnamed individual. It suggested, without stating outright, that the arrangement was designed to deceive the European partners and by extension the firm's investors. By noon, 3 larger outlets had picked it up. By 3 in the afternoon, there was a photographer outside the townhouse. By evening, Marcus's name had been identified. He watched the coverage from the townhouse's small study, with a feeling he hadn't experienced since Diane's diagnosis, the specific helplessness of a situation that had already been set in motion by forces outside your control, where the best you could do was decide how to respond to what you couldn't prevent. His phone rang. It was Nora. "I saw it," she said. "Are you all right?" "I'm all right. Is Ava? She's with you." "She's fine." A pause. "Don't let her see any of it." Evelyn came to find him at 9 that evening. She had been on calls for 6 hours with lawyers, with her communications team, with the board, with the European partners' representatives. She looked, for the first time since Marcus had known her, fatigued in a way that had gotten through her defenses. "I owe you an apology," she said. "You warned me there were risks," Marcus said. "I minimized them." She sat across from him in the study. In the leather chair she usually avoided, she preferred to stand. "Vincent has been building toward this for months." "I knew that. I didn't anticipate he'd move this quickly." "What does he want?" "The firm," she said simply. "He wants to position himself as the stabilizing force after my removal. The merger fails. The board blames me. Vincent steps in with a restructuring proposal he's already written." She was quiet for a moment. "It's actually quite elegant, as acts of predation go." "He came to see me," Marcus said. She looked up. 2 days ago. "I didn't mention it because I wasn't sure what he was building toward. He offered me $2 million to disappear." Marcus watched her face. "He said you'd never find out. He said you'd understand, eventually, that it was in everyone's best interest." Evelyn's expression went through 3 distinct phases in quick succession: shock, calculation, and then something that Marcus had not expected to see. Something that looked very much like the particular hurt of being confirmed in a fear you had carried for a long time. "And?" she said. "I told him no," Marcus said. "But I thought you should know." She looked at him for a long moment. "Why didn't you take it?" He had been thinking about this for 2 days, turning the answer over to find its real shape. "Because I've spent a lot of time recently watching people decide that you're a transaction," he said. "I didn't want to be another one of those people." Evelyn looked away first. In 12 years of negotiations, she had never been the first one to look away. The emergency shareholder meeting was called for day 22. Evelyn's legal team had been working for 72 hours, and their assessment was straightforward. The contractual arrangement, while ethically complicated, was not illegal. What it had done was provide Vincent with exactly the narrative he needed to crystallize the board's existing doubts into something actionable. Marcus was not supposed to be there. He had no role in the company, no stake in the outcome, no legal standing in any chamber of the building where 43 investors, 12 board members, and approximately 30 support staff had gathered to decide the future of Sinclair Capital Group. He was, in every formal sense, irrelevant. He went anyway. Raymond drove him. He wore the navy suit Patricia had helped him select. And he sat in the back of the car and watched the city pass and thought about Diane the way he sometimes did in moments that required a kind of courage he wasn't sure he could locate in himself. He thought about the way she used to say, without irony, that the right thing and the hard thing were usually the same thing, and that the only question was whether you had the stomach for the coincidence. He took the elevator to the 14th floor, found a seat at the back of the observation area, a glassed-off section above the main meeting room, where guests and non-voting parties could watch the proceedings, and settled in. Evelyn was already speaking. She stood at the front of the room with the precision and control of someone who had prepared for years for a moment exactly like this. She walked the board through the numbers, the timeline, the strategic rationale for the merger. She was brilliant, and she was correct, and Marcus could see, from where he sat, that it was not enough. Vincent Cole sat in the third row of board seats, with his hands folded and his face arranged into an expression of regretful concern, and the atmosphere in the room had already tilted. When the floor opened for comment, Vincent stood. He spoke for 4 minutes. He was precise, measured, and devastating, in the specific way that a prepared person can be devastating to a true thing. Not by being more truthful, but by being more organized. He acknowledged Evelyn's intelligence. He expressed admiration for her track record. He framed his concern as institutional, as fiduciary, as regrettably necessary. He used the word unfortunately 6 times in 4 minutes. Marcus recognized the word from Gerald Fitch. He stood up. There was a procedure for public comment from the observation area. And he followed it, raised his hand, was acknowledged by the meeting chair, walked to the microphone at the edge of the observation window. He was aware of every face in the room, turning toward him with the particular attention that strangers command in formal spaces. He didn't have notes. He thought about that for a second, and decided notes weren't what this needed. "My name is Marcus Reed," he said. "I'm the man in the arrangement you've been discussing. I'm a mechanic. I'm a single father. I have about $400 in my checking account right now. And I want to be honest with you about something, because I've noticed that honesty is in short supply in this room today." The room was very quiet. "Everything Mr. Cole said about the arrangement is factually accurate," Marcus continued. "It was a transaction. It was designed to manage an impression. I agreed to it for money, because I needed money. And if you want to use that to make a judgment about Evelyn Sinclair's character, I can't stop you." He paused. He had not planned what came next. It arrived on its own. "What I can tell you is what I saw in the 3 weeks I spent in that woman's orbit. I saw her talk to people who worked for her, the way some people don't talk to anyone like they mattered. I saw her spend 40 minutes on the phone with a junior analyst at 11 at night, walking him through a model because he was scared, and she knew the material cold. I saw her turn down a side arrangement that would have made her personally richer and would have been bad for the firm, because her judgment of what was right overrode what was personally convenient." He let that settle. "I also watched a man in this room spend 3 weeks building a story designed to destroy someone he's supposed to serve. I don't know what the business case is for that. But I know what the human case is." Vincent Cole's expression had not changed, but something behind it had. "I was offered $2 million to leave quietly," Marcus said. "I'm standing here instead. Make of that what you will." He walked back to his seat. The room stayed quiet for a long time after. Vincent's final move came 48 hours after the shareholder meeting. It was elegant in the way a trap is elegant, baited with something real, closed at a pressure point Marcus had not anticipated. The story was 22 years old, when Marcus was 20, briefly lost and angry in the particular way that young men get lost and angry. He had been arrested for a misdemeanor, a fight outside a bar, a charge that had been reduced and eventually expunged when he was 24. He had moved past it completely. He had spent 18 years being the kind of person the 20-year-old version of himself would not have predicted. The record should not have been accessible. Evelyn's legal team spent 2 days documenting that it had been obtained improperly through a private investigation firm that had connections to a former state attorney's office employee who was no longer employed for reasons that had begun to interest several people. None of that mattered immediately. What mattered immediately was the headline. The board scheduled an emergency vote for day 28. The question before them was a confidence motion, a formal mechanism by which the board could ask a chief executive to step aside, pending an independent review. It was, as Evelyn's lawyers confirmed, technically within the board's authority. It had never been used against a founder in the firm's history. Evelyn met with each board member individually in the 48 hours before the vote. Marcus stayed in the townhouse and did not watch the news. He cooked because it was the thing he could do, not well, not professionally, but with the specific competence of a person who has been making food for a child for years. He made soup and bread and left them in the kitchen for whoever needed them. And Walter watched him do this with an expression of quiet, professional respect. On the morning of the vote, Evelyn came to find him at breakfast. "I want you to know something," she said. "Before today." He looked up. "What you said in that room," she stopped. Started again. "I've had a lot of people speak on my behalf. Lawyers, advisors, communications professionals, people I pay significant amounts of money to represent my interests." She sat down across from him at the kitchen table the first time she had sat at the kitchen table. No one has ever said anything true about me in a public setting. I only said what I observed, Marcus said. That's what I mean. She looked at her hands on the table. They were very still. She had remarkable physical control. But this stillness was different from her professional stillness. This was the stillness of someone sitting still on purpose because otherwise they might not be. I've been thinking about what I want to be true about my life. Not the firm. My life. And I think I've been using the firm as a substitute for that question for a very long time. She looked at him directly. I'm going to the vote today. Whatever happens, I want you to know that the 30 days, the arrangement, whatever we call it, I don't regret it. And I'm not certain I know what to do with that, but I wanted you to know. Marcus put down his fork. He thought about 17 different things at once, the logistics of his real life. Nora's patience, Ava's sneakers, the towel in the window, the way certain moments accumulate weight that isn't apparent until later. He thought about a woman who had built something enormous and was sitting at a kitchen table for the first time because she had run out of other rooms. I'll be here when you get back, he said. She went to the vote. At 2:17 in the afternoon, Evelyn Sinclair resigned from her own company. She walked out of the building into the afternoon light and got into the car and came home. And when she walked through the door, Marcus was in the kitchen where he'd said he'd be, and she stood in the doorway for a moment and then came in and sat at the table, and he put a bowl of soup in front of her and sat across from her, and neither of them said anything for a long time. It was the most at home Marcus had felt in 3 weeks. The 30 days ended on a Tuesday, which was the same day of the week the limousine had arrived. Marcus accepted the escrow release. The money was in his account by 9 in the morning, and he sat with his phone in his hand for a while, looking at the number, the way you look at something you needed so badly for so long that its arrival feels slightly unreal. He paid Gerald Fitch 2 months in advance. He took Ava to the dentist, no drama, no choosing between bills, just an appointment. He opened a small savings account in Ava's name. He paid off the electric bill, the water bill, the balance on a medical charge from the previous year that had been going to collections. He bought Ava new sneakers. She cried, which she would have denied doing. But her eyes were very bright when she put them on. He went back to his apartment on Decker Avenue and stood in his kitchen and looked at everything, the water stain on the ceiling he'd been meaning to report to Fitch, the drawer that stuck unless you lifted the handle, the window in Ava's room with the towel along the sill. None of it looked different. He looked different. Something in the quality of how he moved through his own space had changed. He called Nora. She came over with food, the way she always did when things were complicated. They sat at the kitchen table, and he told her the whole story, the real version. The complete version. Not the edited account he'd given her at the start. She listened the way she had always listened to him. Without interrupting, without flinching. With the steady, assessing intelligence of someone who has known you your entire life and loves you partly because of what that knowledge costs her. So what happens now? Nora asked. I don't know, Marcus said. I need to find work. Real work. Something I can build something from. What do you want to build? He had been thinking about this. For years he had been surviving, organizing his days around preventing things from getting worse. The month in Evelyn's world had done something unexpected. It had reminded him that he was capable of more than prevention. He had, without planning to, made an impression. He had, without trying to, changed the direction of a room. He had stood at a microphone in front of 40-odd investors and told the truth, and the room had listened. A shop, he said. A real one. Not just a garage. Something with space for a couple of lifts, maybe a specialty in older vehicles. The kind that need real diagnostic work. He paused. I have enough for a down payment on a lease. Nora looked at him for a long moment. You've thought about this before. I've thought about it for years, he said. I just didn't think it was possible. Evelyn called 3 days after he moved back to his apartment. She did not frame the call as a social call. She was incapable of that kind of pretense, but it was, underneath its pragmatic surface, exactly that. She was in the process of sorting out the legal and financial aftermath of her resignation, which was considerable. She had retained 2 firms. She was working through it. They talked for 40 minutes. About the merger, which had stalled, as she'd expected, but not collapsed, which she had not expected. About Vincent Cole, who had been removed from the board after the firm's new interim leadership discovered a series of financial irregularities that Vincent had been careful, but not careful enough, to conceal. About Walter, who was still in the townhouse, making soup. "I've been thinking about what's next," she said, near the end of the call. "And? I don't know yet," she said. "That's a strange thing to say. I have always known what was next." A pause. "I went for a walk this morning. Without Raymond. Without my phone. I walked 14 blocks and sat in a park and watched pigeons for 20 minutes. How was it?" "Unexpectedly tolerable," she said. There was something in her voice he hadn't heard before, the early edge of something lighter. "I may try it again tomorrow." After the call ended, Marcus sat in his kitchen in the familiar sounds of Decker Avenue, the building settling, the traffic, the distant rhythm of the city, and felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Not happiness exactly. Not yet, but its precondition. The ground state from which other things could grow. Vincent Cole was indicted on 7 counts of securities fraud and 2 counts of breach of fiduciary duty, 4 months after the shareholder meeting. The investigation had been underway. Marcus later learned, for longer than any of them had known a parallel process that had nothing to do with Evelyn and everything to do with the financial irregularities that turned out, on examination, to be systematic rather than incidental. At the federal evidentiary hearing, Marcus testified. He had been approached by the prosecutor's office about the $2 million offer. It was, in the context of the broader case, a small piece of a much larger pattern, but prosecutors wanted every piece. He sat in the witness box in the same Navy suit he'd worn to the shareholder meeting and answered questions for 90 minutes with the same directness he brought to everything. He described the offer. He described Vincent's manner, the particular smoothness of it, the way the money had been framed not as a bribe, but as a reasonable accommodation for everyone involved. He described saying no. The prosecutor asked why. Marcus thought about this for a moment before answering. "Because I was raised to believe that there are things that aren't for sale," he said. "And I'd spent enough time recently forgetting that. I didn't want to forget it again." Vincent Cole was convicted on all counts. He was sentenced to 6 years. Evelyn was offered her position back 2 months after the trial concluded. The board that extended the offer was a different board from the one that had accepted her resignation. 3 members had resigned voluntarily. 2 others had been removed as part of the governance review triggered by the Cole investigation. The offer came with full reinstatement of her equity and a board restructuring agreement she had negotiated herself over 3 weeks, with the precision and patience of someone who had decided never again to be caught without documentation. She accepted the offer. She also accepted, as part of her return, 2 conditions she had proposed herself. A formal profit-sharing program for employees below the director level, and a foundation independently governed, independently funded, that would provide support for single-parent households in economic distress. She named it for no one. She told the press it was a structural acknowledgement that certain kinds of value don't appear on balance sheets. Marcus heard about the foundation from Nora, who read about it in a business publication. He called Evelyn. "You didn't tell me," he said. "I wasn't sure you'd want credit," she said. "I don't," he said. "I just wanted to know it was real." "It's real," she said. By then, Marcus had leased a space on the east side of the city. A former service station with good bones and a parking area that could fit 12 vehicles. He had 2 lifts installed, a professional diagnostic system, and a small waiting area with decent chairs and a coffee maker that worked. He hired a young mechanic named Owen, who was fresh out of trade school, and had the kind of focused quietness that Marcus recognized from his own early years. He taught Owen the way good mechanics teach, by asking questions instead of giving answers. By letting the work explain itself. The shop was called Reed Automotive. No flourish, just the name. Ava came after school on the days she didn't have activities and did her homework at the small desk he'd set up in the back office. She had made friends at school, real ones. the kind formed through the accumulation of small moments rather than a single dramatic event. She had stopped being careful with her laugh. On a Saturday in October, when the shop was closed and the city had shifted into the particular quality of light that belongs to that month, Evelyn came. She drove herself. She had started doing that. He knew. As a deliberate practice, she parked imprecisely and didn't care. She walked through the open bay door and looked around with the systematic attention she gave to everything, and Marcus watched her take it in. "It's good," she said. "It's a start," he said. She walked the length of the shop, looking at the equipment, running a hand along the edge of one of the lifts. She stopped in front of a photograph he'd pinned to the wall near the office door. Ava, at 6, laughing at something off camera, the kind of photograph that makes you feel what it felt like to be in that moment. "She looks like Diane," Evelyn said. She had only ever heard Diane described. But she had the right instinct. "She does," Marcus said. They stood in the shop in the October light, and Evelyn turned to him with the directness she brought to everything, and said, "I've been trying to figure out what to do with the fact that I miss you." Marcus leaned against the lift with his arms crossed, the way he stood when he was thinking. "What have you figured out?" "That I'm better at strategy than at this," she said. "And that I'm going to need to work on that." He uncrossed his arms. He walked across the shop and stood in front of her, close enough that the distance was no longer professional, and he said, "I'm not going anywhere. We can both work on it." She looked at him for a long moment with those assessing eyes. Then something shifted. Not performance, not strategy. Not the architecture of a woman who had learned to run cold. Something real and slightly unguarded and entirely her own. "All right," Evelyn Sinclair said. "Let's work on it." The light came through the bay door and lay across the floor of the shop in long rectangular panels. Somewhere outside, in the direction of Nora's neighborhood, Ava was at a friend's house, laughing at something. A Saturday in October. Ordinary and enough. The right things sometimes take a long time to arrive, but they are worth the wait, and they are worth the work, and they are worth every choice that was made in the dark of an ordinary Tuesday night by a man who had almost scrolled past. The Sinclair Foundation awarded its first grants in February. 47 families received support across 11 categories: child care assistance, rental stabilization funds, vocational retraining, emergency medical subsidies. The foundation's director, a woman named Claire Ashby, who had spent 15 years running a community development nonprofit, described the application process in an interview as aggressively respectful. She meant that it did not ask people to justify their need in order to receive help. It asked them what they intended to do with it. Marcus submitted an application on behalf of Owen's younger brother, who was 18 and enrolled in a trade program and needed equipment he couldn't afford. The application was granted. He didn't tell Owen where the grant came from. Owen found out anyway, in the way people always find out things in small shops. Owen didn't say anything about it. He just stayed late 3 Saturdays in a row to help Marcus finish a restoration project, a 1968 Ford Bronco belonging to a retired schoolteacher who had bought it new and kept it for 50 years without being asked. That was the language of the shop. Ava turned 9 in November. The party was at Nora's house, 12 children, a cake that was mostly frosting by design, a chaotic 90 minutes that left the backyard covered in streamers. Evelyn came. She stood slightly outside the radius of the chaos, with her hands in her coat pockets, watching, and when Ava spotted her from across the yard, she ran over and crashed into her with the full force of an 8-year-old who has decided someone is family. Evelyn held on. Later, after the other children had gone, and Ava had fallen asleep on Nora's couch under a blanket, Marcus and Evelyn walked back to his car through the neighborhood's quiet evening streets. The trees had lost most of their leaves. The air smelled of wood smoke and cold. They walked close enough that their shoulders touched, which was a thing they had been doing lately without discussing it. "She called me family," Evelyn said. "She calls a lot of people family," Marcus said. "She gets it from her mother. Is that something that can be earned?" Evelyn asked. It was the real question, beneath the question not about Ava's word for her, but about whether the life she was slowly building with this man and this child was something that could be legitimate, something that could hold. Marcus thought about the pen in the nightstand drawer. He thought about Diane's voice, saying that the right thing and the hard thing were usually the same thing. He thought about a limousine at the curb on a Tuesday morning, and a 3-line job posting, and 4 honest sentences typed in the dark. "Yeah," he said. "It can be earned." They walked to the car. The neighborhood was quiet. The leaves moved a little in the wind, and the houses had their lights on. And somewhere, a dog was barking at nothing in particular. And it was an ordinary evening in an ordinary street. And it was, Marcus Reed thought, more than enough.